they have pain blockage from that. But then also when they get one of the kill bites or they get a lot of blood loss, they're going to have hemorrhagic shock, which is more opioids being released. So it's as if God intentionally wanted to make sure that when creatures were dying, that they did not experience pain.
Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts. Tonight I'm gonna get you something very, very special because tonight I have one topic which many people have told me to address, which is going to be the topic of animal pain, animal suffering, and how a theist deals with the problem of animal pain and animal suffering. So tonight's guest is Dr. Victoria Campbell, Global Methodist Church, PhD in Theology, London School of Theology, Middlesex University, and PhD in Chemistry, University of Texas, Austin, author of The Problem of Animal Pain. So tonight's discussion is going to be about a groundbreaking book which actually had a lot of impact on me, which is the Cambridge Elements, The Problem of Animal Pain. And for this, I want to invite Dr. Victoria Campbell on stage. Dr. Victoria,
Hi,
welcome
it's
to
so
Inside
nice to be with
Thoughts.
you. Hi. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
it's my
It's so nice
pleasure.
to be with you and your audience.
Yeah, if you can just give us a brief introduction about yourself, like, for those who might not be familiar with your work, what are your contributions to the problem of
Okay.
animal pain?
Okay, so my work is in the problem of animal pain. That is something that when I realized that I needed to go back, I had a PhD in chemistry and I had never really had a problem with science and faith. But I remember my son came home and said, Mom, my friends don't believe in God, they believe in science. And that's when I realized I was being called to do something about that. So I went to seminary for theology, and my professor had been very close to his professor of theology, but that was back in the day when every right-thinking philosopher was an atheist. And my professor of philosophy was very upset because his mentor, they were very close, like father and son. His mentor had died, and the one obstacle for him believing in a loving God was the problem of animal pain. So that's basically why I started this work. So a lot of my focus is understanding the problem or the purpose of pain, both for animals and for human beings, because we experience it differently, and sometimes there's different approaches to how we deal with that, but it's still important for both. So that's generally where my research is. So I did write the for Cambridge University Press, The Problem of Animal Pain, and I also do other articles and papers that I'm submitting and having published.
Okay, yeah. So just for my audience to know, like I really liked, your literature on this, and it is actually touching on a few things which not many people have focused on, which is combining theology, science, and philosophy all together to have a more robust answer to the problem of animal pain, which is where I'm really interested in to dwell into the whole subject. So can you give us a clear introduction to this topic, and how to deal with the issue, what the issue exactly is, everything.
Yes. Okay. So this is a topic that's been discussed for quite some time, and the best philosophers for articulating the atheist view of animal suffering are really Paul Draper and William Rowe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the audience to basically what their arguments are, what their claims are, and then we're going to kind of break them down. And what we're going to realize is that they are making some claims that could be analyzed by science to see, is this actually factual, or is it a misunderstanding of what we observe in animals? And then there are other claims that they make that are actually theological, claims about God and God's value system that we're going to look at. So we'll frame the beginning like that, and then we'll take a step into the science and begin to ask questions about, okay, what are some common misconceptions? How does pain become perceived in human beings? And how do we see that among other species? Do all other species feel pain? Do no species feel pain? Which ones do, which ones don't? And then we'll get into the purpose of pain, how pain could be there are natural processes that actually lessen pain. We'll look at those a little bit. And then we're going to then conclude with looking at the theological aspects of empathy and pain and how that ties into the greater meaning of the universe and existence. And then we'll go back and conclude by looking again at what William Rowe said and what Paul Draper said and close up there.
Right. Sounds good to me. Yeah.
So is that good? Okay, so we're good. You can see this?
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
Okay, then I'm gonna go ahead and get started. All right, so
Sure.
today, like I said, we're going to talk about science and theology on the purpose of pain. And so,
Hmm.
like I said, this is the book I was talking about, the problem of animal pain. A lot, but not everything will be coming from this book. And so I wanted to present Paul Draper's arguments first because he did a really good job. He has two papers, Pain and Pleasure, an evidential problem for theists. And he also wrote Natural Selection and the Problem of Evil. So in those, first of all, he assumes a hedonistic moral standard for biological systems. That's a pleasure-oriented value system. And he explicitly states that pleasure is intrinsically good and that pain is intrinsically bad. And he also makes the claim that suffering in nature is widespread and largely unnecessary. He also therefore
Right.
assumes that a wholly good God's goal would be to minimize suffering and maximize the biological success and pleasure of creatures. So you would live as long as possible, you would have as much pleasure during that life, and also you would pass on your genetic, offspring as much, abundantly. So he goes on to make a claim that is a lot of people have talked about, and that's he makes two hypotheses. One is the hypothesis of indifference, which is the atheistic worldview of an indifferent universe that's unconcerned with creaturely pleasure or pain. On the other hand, the hypothesis of theism is the conceptual core of, and I'm speaking from the Judeo-Christian view, but in that case, theism says that the universe revolves around God's love for creatures and God's creation. So
Hmm.
Draper says that his hypothesis of indifference is more probable given all the evidence out in the world, and it makes more sense than the hypothesis of theism. So one of the things he's doing is the reasoning method he's using here is inference to the best explanation. And it's like what we do in science. We use scientific hypotheses. So it's a well-known form of reasoning, and it evaluates hypotheses according to which has the greatest explanatory power. So that basically means like whatever hypothesis can take and address the greatest amount of data or evidence from different sources, make sense of it, and not only that, but use it to predict outcomes. That is the best hypothesis. That is the best explanation. So that's basically the tool that Paul Draper is using. So William Rowe had a article, a paper, "The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism," and he took a similar approach, but I like it because it's nice and clean. Okay, so the first
Hmm.
premise is there exists instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. And the second premise is that an omniscient, holy, good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. And if these two claims are true, then it is reasonable to assume that there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good being. And so looking at these two premises, on a superficial level, they make a lot of sense and it's very understandable. why a lot of people would agree with William Rowe. But I'd like to point out that his argument includes these two important defeaters, where he says that such pain or suffering would be acceptable if the prevention of suffering permitted an evil that was equally bad or worse, or if the prevention of suffering permitted the loss of a greater good. So he does admit that if there was either one of these criteria were fulfilled, then it would really weaken his argument. So one of the things I would like to just notice is premise one. This is an evidential premise. You can see that on the left side of the screen. The evidential
Hmm.
premise is making some claims about perceived facts that that exist in the world that are out there. So this is something that we can evaluate with the scientific literature. Like we can make these claims, but are they true? And we can actually use the science to look at them. The second premise is a theological premise. It is making certain truth claims about what the value system of God would be. Now, in this case, he's making a theological claim that a good God would have a pleasure-oriented value system. So again, it is like Paul Draper, where it is hedonistic. It's saying the greatest good is pleasure. Okay.
Hmm.
Uh, Now, that's something that could be challenged because scripturally, it would appear that at least the God described in scripture, not the God of the philosophers, but the one of scriptures,
Hmm.
imply that love is the greatest value system. So we'll look at that at the latter half of this talk. But so this is the argument of William Rowe. And so this is basically why I'm going to organize the rest of this talk. By the first half, we're going to look at the evidential premise here through the lens of science and say, are these truth claims an accurate depiction of nature, or is it a somewhat superficial, shallow understanding of what's going on that most you see commonly among philosophers? They don't go to the scientific literature first to see, is what I'm saying true? They just make the claim. And the same thing with the theological premise. We'll analyze it later. So here I want to just state what most atheists claim more explicitly. So they'll claim there's widespread suffering in the natural order. There's unnecessary suffering in the natural order. God is characterized as an omnipotent being, and a holy, good, omnipotent being like God would prevent widespread and unnecessary suffering. God has not prevented widespread unnecessary suffering, and therefore an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good God does not exist, or he's not good. So I want to give the example of, I was talking about sometimes philosophers just give superficial understandings of reality. So William Rowe does this in the same paper. He discusses a burnt fawn, and many philosophers have referred to this young deer that gets hurt, as Bambi, because the famous Walt Disney movie, Bambi. And this is actually a screenshot from the movie Bambi. So in it, philosopher Rowe describes a fawn trapped in a forest fire. And sadly, this young deer gets horribly burnt by the fire. It is suffering alone for days in the forest before it has a terrible agonizing death. But the thing is this true? And we find that it's actually a caricature of of reality, because in 1988 in Yellowstone National Park, there were forest fires, and that was a great time for the wildlife fire ecologists to look at what was really happening with the animals. And we find that they have a lot of corrections to make to Rowe's caricature. So what they found is that most animals escaped the fire. That they found, instead of deer fleeing before the flames, you found all those animals and bison and elk grazing and resting within 300 feet or less of these fires. And in this picture, you can see the baby bison just laying on the grass. Doesn't seem very concerned. Neither are the adults. What they also found was that it was deaths from this fire are actually very rare. But when you did see a fire related death, it was usually because they were fences that human beings had built that trapped the animals, unfortunately. So that either that or very fast moving fires. But in either case, it's not the flames that ever kill the animal. It is actually smoke inhalation. And when you inhale that smoke, it very quickly knocks you unconscious, and you die of asphyxiation, not burns. So it really Rowe was making as his evidence for how cruel God is was actually just fiction. And actually, many animals and plants, we have to remember, have adapted to fire because fire is natural in the environment. So we see voles, lizards, rattlesnakes, and other small animals bury into the ground. They're in burrows, and that's where they stay safe when there's a fire. We also see this with birds and amphibians. Birds can fly away. They move to thickets, scrubby thickets that are near wet soil. You have amphibians that are already kind of naturally close to moist soil, so they can dig into the soil or get into the water and they won't be harmed by the fire. And then we also have to remember that, philosophers have a habit of, oh, there's destruction is inherently evil. And they don't think about the fact that these are natural life cycles. These are ecosystems that you need these changing events to keep them healthy, and that disruption is natural and not catastrophic. So, for example, when you have these forest fires, we have to remember that the ashes of those trees are returning nutrients back into the soil. It becomes very organically rich, and plants that were before, they were shaded out by the trees. Now with the additional sunlight, you can get new plant growth, you get wildflowers. And these new meadowlands invite bees and other pollinating insects, and deer and elk and mice move in. And then because they're there, you have the predators moving in: coyotes, bobcats, mountain lions, bears, and wolves. And so we have to realize that this is just a refreshed start of nature's ecosystem cycle, and it will eventually, with time, become a forest again. And all of that's okay, and all of that is good. So that is a good time to, I'll take that off the screen. So,
I remember there was one person who was like, was fascinated a lot with these forest fires and what happens. And he told me, if I'm not mistaken, he did not tell me, but he was mentioning, and I heard on a video where there are some sort of seeds which only germinate when a forest fire happens. Like those seeds would only germinate because of the heat of the forest fire or something like that. So I was very fascinated by that. That okay, so there are specifically seeds which need forest fires to germinate, and then they would like sprout in that sense. So that was really fascinating. I just wanted to make that comment.
yeah, and you see that with ponderosa pines, but they're not the only seeds. Like some seeds need to be scarified. Like the seed is so tough and protective, it needs some harshness, either hard winter freezes or a fire to burn it, or something that to make it easier to germinate. In fact, even we look at the black forest and it looks terrible and oh my gosh, it's dead. And we don't think, number one, there's so many seeds in there that are ready to germinate. I mean, like if you have ever had a garden and you try to suppress the weeds, you can't. They love you. You can take off all the plants and you want bare dirt, you will never get it because nature wants to take over those empty spaces. And even when the animals eat plants in one area that has not been destroyed, but then they start going into the newer growth areas, even as they're making droppings, we'll say it that way.
Mm.
They're making droppings on the ground. They're naturally fertilizing the plants that will be their food source and helping to plant new gardens in those
Wow.
devastated areas.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. So yeah, I don't have any question in particular.
And
In
that's
fact,
one
I'm
of the
more
things
interested.
okay.
Yeah, go
And
ahead.
that's one of the things that I think that we've really missed from philosophers is there's all this beauty in creation. In fact, that's one of the things that scientists get very excited about and why they love their research is like the more they study creation, the more excited and the more it makes sense and the more ordered it is. And that's true in nature
Mm.
too. So I think, that's something that the philosophers really haven't done justice to. All right, so continuing, we're going to go back to Rowe's argument because it's a good way to organize how we're going to talk through the rest of this conversation. So, I just noticed that it's squishing some of the words, but that's all right. Evidential premise. It doesn't
Mm.
fit very well, but hopefully that won't be a problem for most of these. But okay, so now I'm going to talk about William Rowe's essay on the problem of evil and some varieties of atheism. We're just going to look at that again to notice that first premise is an evidential premise and the second one is theological. So we're going to start by looking at more of the science to evaluate his truth claims. Is it true that
Mm.
there's widespread unnecessary suffering among animals? So
Mm.
first, let's ask, is pain just bad or can it have a benevolent purpose we haven't thought about?
Mm.
So we asked the question, couldn't we do without pain? But we realize when we look at the science, there's a biological purpose to pain, and it is actually a protective mechanism of the body. So when a normal person gets a blister on their foot, they want to protect their foot. They would take off their shoe, they would limp, they would avoid walking on it because with continued stress on that, continued repetitious stress on the injury, it's just going to get worse and worse. So we know when we feel pain, we have to get the pressure off of it, leave it alone until it has a chance to heal. But a
Huh.
leper, someone that has leprosy, no longer is able to feel pain in their extremities. Basically, leprosy is caused by a bacterial infection that destroys the nerve endings in the body. So the
Mm.
only places that can still feel pain are places like the armpit pit, but they're not at the extremity. So a leper who gets a blister on their foot, they're going to continue walking on it because they have no idea they are hurting their tissues. So as they continue to the repetitive stress, and then the blister breaks, and then they can get bacteria in it, and then they keep walking on it. They can get an infection. They feel no pain, so the infection gets worse because they don't know to clean it. They don't know there's even a problem there, and some lepers, they get infections that are so bad, but they don't know because without pain, they don't even realize they have one until the smell becomes bad. This is in Dr. Paul Brand's book, The Gift of Pain, but he talks about this, and so this this continuing walking on it to the point in infections that are untreated can cause the bone to start being damaged and even having just the bone within the part of the foot dissolves until there's no bone left.
Wow.
So
Wow.
that's part of the reason why we have to feel pain. We have to be told to protect our tissues. And unless that's internal signal, we would ignore it. Okay, so we also see, that we have a problem not just with lepers, but when we have children that are born without the ability to feel pain. The technical term for that is congenital sensitivity to pain. And in it, like Matthew Lieberman writes excellent book, Social How We Are Wired to Connect. And he says that children born with this congenital insensitivity to pain are incapable of feeling pain and often die in the first few years of life because they injure themselves relentlessly. They often fall victim to deadly infections. And so we think, oh, not being able to feel pain would be a real blessing, but it's not a blessing. And it actually leads to premature death. And we see that in lepers. We see that in children that are born without the ability to feel pain. So the science suggests that the biological purpose of pain is to increase the longevity of the creatures. So
Mm.
it's not there to punish, it's not there to harm,
Mm.
it's there to warn the creature to protect themselves. So they will live longer and have better health. So I wanted us to talk, it's easiest to talk about human pain first because we are familiar with human pain. And if we understand how that works, then it's easier to understand how it works in other animals. So there's several components to human pain perception. The first one is nociception. Nociception receptors are the passive detectors of noxious stimuli. So either if you feel something on your finger, your knee, your toes, anywhere on your skin, you have these nociceptive receptors. And basically, they are passive detective signals that tell you if there's noxious stimuli that can harm tissues. So that could be something corrosive. It could be something abrasive. It could be something sharp. Okay. And they are just detectors. They're located on the surface of the skin. Sometimes you can have a nociceptive response that's reflexive. It's unconscious, but it's not pain. And that signal, though, from the nociceptor can go from the extremities of the body up to the spinal cord and then up the spinal cord to the brain. So in vertebrates that have brains, it goes to their brain signal. So like, let me just give you an example. You can get an automatic reflex from this. So one time I don't make caramel or candy very often. All right. So I was trying to make a caramel for a flan because I like to cook and I'm making dessert. So basically you have to heat up sugar to a very high heat. And stupidly, I'm used to cooking soups and things, so I can put my finger in the soup and taste it. Well, I put my finger in the caramel, which is a lot hotter, and immediately, before I even knew what was happening, I had immediate withdrawal on my finger that was completely reflexive and unconscious. Why? Because when you burn your finger like on the stove, your fingertip sends a fast signal from the nociceptive receptors to up your arm to your spine. And the spine has a reflexive response that shoots back down to the hand. This whole thing moves in about 300 meters per second. And it sends a signal to all the arm muscles to retract so that you quickly pull the hand away from the hot stove. But that's without conscious thought. It's a reflex. But about a heartbeat afterwards, the signal has then gone up to your brain, and that's where you begin to process it as pain, which we'll talk about that next. But basically, I want to make an analogy for this because this is important because nociception is found in all creatures. So even amoebas and bacteria
Mm.
had nociception. They can interact with the things in their environment. They either know it's food and move forward, or they think it's something hurtful and they retract. It's a reflex. But nociception is not pain. It is not pain. But you will read sloppy writing that treats it like pain. And what we're going to do is we're going to break it down into all the components so you can tell when is it pain, and when is it not. So in this analogy, I'd like to use a security system on a house. So if you have a security system on the house, you're going to have detectors on your windows and your doors so that if someone tries to open a window or open a door when it's supposed to be locked, those detectors on the windows, on the doors, they're passive. They're just detecting. Okay. So that's what that piece. So the next part of our pain perception is there's a sensory aspect. So, like I said, when I burned my finger on the stove, that signal went from my finger to my spine, and then it went up the spine to the sense to give me the sensory aspect of pain perception. So that's in the back part of your brain. It's the parietal lobe. And that gives you locational information. That was telling me my finger, my right finger, and it was telling me the type of harm. It felt burnt. And it tells me how severe is the damage. And it hurt badly, and later on it would blister. Okay. But that part that's the part of your brain that's telling you the location and the type of harm is actually, there's no emotional or distressing component to that. So when we go back to the security system on the house analogy, this is like having the detectors at the windows and the back door. The one at the back door notices someone's trying to get in the back door. Well, it sends a signal through the wires to the security system service. The company sends a phone call to notify them that there's a disturbance at the back door, and it initiates a counter response. Like maybe they will send out some officers to come and check the house, but it's not
Mm.
setting off alarms. The same way that my automatic reflex did something to prevent, further harm, but that didn't
Mm.
actually cause pain perception. Okay. So now we're going to go to the part that does. There's another aspect of our pain perception experience, and that is actually the distressing aspect. This occurs in
Mm.
the frontal lobe of the brain. This gives us the emotional information, the level of psychological distress. That is the response that we get. It causes us to cry, to be afraid, to feel angry. That happens in the frontal lobe. And part of it is to now focus your attention. Like, this isn't like I just brushed my finger against a, a, a piece of paper. My finger is in damage. The pain is alerting me to pay attention, focus my attention, and take care of it. So, and one of the things that we need to remember though, and we've all experienced this, if you've had severe pain, there's a danger to the pain because as that psychological distress increases, our ability to defend ourselves, like self-defense, decreases. If you're in a fetal position because you broke a leg and there's a lion nearby, he's going to eat you. So there's
Mm.
a danger pain, right? So that distressing aspect. So, and we'll discuss that in a little bit, but we're going to find out that the adrenal response actually blocks pain. So if you do get injured when you're fighting a lion, you're not going to pay attention to it, and you're going to do what you need to do to survive, and you'll feel the pain later. Okay. So
Got
basically, this part of the distressing aspect from the frontal lobe, this is like, in the analogy, the loud, unpleasant alarm that is alerting everyone to danger, right? Wah, 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 there's someone breaking in the house. It's the alarm that this is something bad that's happening to your tissues. Pay attention and take care of them so it doesn't get worse. So I'm going to now show you how this works. I want to point out first that nociception is not pain because it doesn't
No, no.
include the frontal lobe. It's just what's happening at the extremities of the creature. Like I said, amoebas have nociception, but they don't experience pain because they don't have a frontal lobe. Okay, so nociception is not pain. Nociceptors are the detectors, not the alarm. And nociceptive reflexes are not painful. Okay, so what is pain and how is it perceived? We can find this out when we, according to the International Association for the Study of Pain, there are these two components to pain, and I've discussed them to some degree. You have pain, the sensory aspect, but you also have to have the distressing aspect. If you don't have a distressing aspect, you can't call it pain.
Mm.
right? So where in our physiology, where do we detect the sensory aspect of pain, which is locational? And if you wanted to put your hand on the top back of your head in the parietal region, you see on the screen the somatosensory cortex and the insula. That's where your brain is telling you, you got a blister on your foot. You have a cut on your knee. You had a burn on your finger. It's telling you the type, and it's telling you where, type of injury, it's telling you where, but it's not telling you how you feel about it. Okay. And so it's the variety and location of the pain. That's all. Now, the distressing aspect of pain, like I said, is in that frontal lobe, but most particularly, the region is called the anterior cingulate cortex. So if you were to take your palm and put it on the top of your head, so that basically the palm is at where your hairline starts and your fingers are pointing straight back, that is the curved area that is your anterior cingulate cortex. And that is the part that tells you the distressing aspects, the emotional, psychological response to pain. So we see this child uh, the crying, they are upset, and we find that what we'll find is that um, we're gonna find that when the mother or father or a friend comes up and comforts them, they will be able to relieve some of that pain in that frontal lobe. And so that's why it's
Mm.
important to pay attention to which parts of the body are doing which parts of the work, because not all animals have those. Some do, but some don't. Okay.
Mm.
All right. So, like I said, the sensory aspect in the back of your brain tells you locational information. The distressing aspect, which tells you the psychological feeling of how you feel about it, do you care, is in the frontal lobe. And that's psychological. So, if you don't have that psychologically distressing emotional response, then you can't call it pain. That's why someone that has a bad injury, but they've been given painkillers, they cannot they're no longer in pain because the psychologically just distressing part is gone. Okay?
Right. Yeah.
So, so one of the things I wanna I kind of I wanna pause there just for a second because I wanted to just point out that before I go into the other animals specifically, I want to talk about some general claims that atheists make. That when we were talking about Rowe and we were talking about Draper, that basically they make three main claims, and they're not the only ones. If you read Richard Dawkins, if you read Philip Kitcher, they also talk about they claim that pain dominates animal existence. And they say that all animal suffering can be added together, and the total amount of suffering proves that God either does not love his creatures or he doesn't exist. And they make another claim that unnecessary animal suffering has been widespread for millions of years across the evolutionary spectrum. And this means that from caterpillars to mammals, they all feel pain. Okay. So I want to make a couple of critiques of that before we go into the next part. And the first is when they make the claim that pain dominates animal existence, it ignores animal play and pleasure. They ignore the happiness, the good feelings they feel when they eat yummy food, when they play and have social interactions, when they get to be in their natural environment. All those things give pleasure and quality life to the animal. So we can't just count the pain, we have to look at the pleasure too. Second, they say that animal suffering can be added together to prove that the loving God that is discussed in scripture doesn't exist. But since we read that part from the International Association for the Study of Pain, pain is subjective and it's a qualitative thing. It is qualitative in nature and not a quantitative entity. For example, when you go to the doctor and you say it hurts, my back hurts, they will ask you on a from 1 to 10, how bad is your pain? because no one
Mm.
knows but you, right? It's completely subjective. And your 5 may not be the same as someone else's 5. So pain can't be treated like objects, like apples, that they can be added up over time or from one creature to the next. Instead, we have to look at the individual creature one by one. And so when they say things like the total amount of animal suffering, well, that's something that can't be quantified over time and across species any more than animal play and satiation can be quantified over the ages. They've been looking at only one half the equation and ignoring the
Mm.
good parts. But furthermore, it's all subjective. You can't add it together. Like if you add all the play and all the pain together, what do you get? I don't know, that we're not counting apples. It's just it's like suggesting that if we add all the crying of babies during human existence, we can safely conclude that their mothers do not love them. Right? That would
Mm.
be an absurd thing to say. And yet
Mm.
that's exactly what they're saying. And so just like each child is comforted individually by the attending presence of their mother or father, in the same way, it's also, we have to realize that it's unsound reasoning to suggest a cumulative sum of creaturely pain can somehow be evidence that God does not love others. So instead of that, we need to look at, put something on my screen, sorry. We need to look
Mm.
at what is happening on an individual basis for the creatures that can feel pain. Okay? And the third thing I wanted to talk about just before moving on to this next part is the third claim they make is unnecessary animal suffering has been widespread for millions of years across the evolutionary spectrum, from caterpillars to mammals. They all feel pain. And one of the things I want to point out is um, philosophers often choose fuzzy philosophical language like consciousness or sentience uh, to muddle that together with pain. Now, like I just explained, the scientific understanding helps us realize that a creature that the only reason pain is perceived is in the frontal lobe, which is an evolutionary advanced part of mammals and actually can be found in birds. And they actually know that because they did this experiment. It's called the singulotomy. It's not something you just do casually. For people that were experiencing extreme constant pain to the point where they were considering suicide, they did this procedure where they could actually sever that ACC, the frontal lobe. They severed it from the rest of the brain so it couldn't send signals back and forth anymore. And what they found is, looking at this picture, the two components of pain, what it did was it removed the ACC's signal, the distressing aspect. It took that out, and they only had the sensory aspect. And they had a very unusual, it's very strange. They could still feel, I have tremendous pain in my back, but it doesn't bother me anymore. And they were able to go back and live an ordinary life. So that's hard for us to understand, but it gives us insight that if a creature doesn't have this frontal lobe and the ability to have this distressing aspect, then they don't feel pain. And so words like
Mm.
sentience are full because that could be, feeling like an amoeba feeling something in its petri dish, or feeling like I feel grief because a loved one died, or I feel pain because I have a broken leg. It's just the word sentience just has too much breadth. It's almost meaningless. So that's where um that's where the scientific evidence can provide a better description of pain perception. And that's where also when philosophers talk about unnecessary animal suffering, um, if they were to actually look at the scientific evidence, which what we're going to do now, they're going to find that pain perception varies greatly across the evolutionary spectrum or across species. And the philosophers have been ignoring biological processes that are natural that reduce pain in animals. Okay, so continuing on now. So when we looked at the brain, the human brain, what we realize is that there's physiological requirements of pain perception that weaken those philosophers' claims. So we see in the scientific literature that humans, mammals, and birds have neurological equivalents in the frontal lobe that produce psychologically distressing aspects of pain. But when we look at reptiles, amphibians, and fish, they do have nociception, so they have the automatic responses, and they actually have parts that have sensory, locational detection, and responses that go with that, but they do not have the evolutionarily more advanced frontal lobe. And so without that frontal lobe, they cannot have psychological distress. And without the psychological distress, they cannot have pain. Okay, so here I wanted to show you, uh, you know, on the right, you see a human brain, and the frontal lobe now is on the right, but this is very similar to other mammals that are smaller. It's just sometimes the brain is shaped differently if their skull is shaped differently, and it may be smaller or larger if it's a whale or a mouse. But generally, otherwise, they have the same correlating areas. Okay. And what they found is that birds also have an equivalent of the frontal lobe. So you'll see that even though you don't have quite the same look to the bird brain, um, they do have an equivalent in that frontal lobe that allows them to feel some level of what we would call the distressing aspect of pain. And just it's for some people, it'd be helpful to see that the advances in human brain development. So the newest part is this neocortex in the pink. And that gives, like we've been discussing, it gives sensory perception, but it also gives cognition and spatial reasoning and language. In the blue part underneath it, that's called the limbic brain. And that is where you have memories, motor control, and decision making. And then the purple part of the image, it represents what the scientists call the reptilian brain. That is the one that gives the messages for fight, flight, feeding, or mating. Okay, so just it helps to get an idea of how we've added advances to our brains to become more highly evolved. So a comparison of the reptilian and the mammalian brains, you can just superficially see the difference between these two. The reptilian brain does not have that frontal lobe or the neocortex. And we see that so here we see a side view of the reptilian brain, and it lacks that frontal lobe. So it has no capacity for psychological distress. In the amphibian brain, it also lacks the frontal lobe, so it has no capacity for psychological distress. And you'll notice it's a similar shape to what the reptilian brain looked like. And it looks similar to the fish brain here. The fish brain lacks the frontal lobe and therefore has no capacity for psychological distress. And so what we find and what the theory of evolution helps us to understand that psychologically distressing pain is unnecessary for species that produce lots of offspring with very little parental investment. Insects are producing like hundreds and thousands of insects, and their parents are not having to take care of them or change diapers, in order to get their offspring to grow and thrive. Same thing with fish. But what we do see then is that pain perception is biologically necessary for survival for intelligent species that require intensive parental investment for child rearing. So we see this across the board for birds. We see them for mammals. So elephants, whales, human beings. It's all a lot of work to raise our children. So we have to make sure that the children we have the best chance of surviving. And that increases with the perception of pain. Okay. So there, it's a good point we're going to move on, but any thoughts or questions?
Hmm. Yeah. So now my question. So before even I have a question, like I had a comment first of all that this was amazing. Like some of the stuff that you just covered. Maybe I did not even know about it, and now that I'm thinking, I'm I know where you're going, and this is gonna be really exciting. So like the why we are building the parenting part, and also the part where why mammals, when they don't have that role, they don't even go through pain in that sense, so they don't go through pain.
Mhm.
So all is gonna come fit very nicely. But before we get to that, I just wanna mention one thing. Now this might be a bit philosophical and might be completely off topic, but
That's
just I just thought that it's but I thought that I would bring this up. So within the psychological part, as you mentioned, now this also touches the area of as you said, that pain is subjective, and the subjective experiential part comes in, which is beyond science in some sense. This is where phenomenology or studies of consciousness or theory of mind comes in.
yeah.
Now there's another issue which I had one guest on my channel. His name is Patrick Flynn, and he wrote this book. Within this book, he had one chapter where he was comparing theism and naturalism, and specifically the problem of suffering was there. Now there's one very recent argument which is linked to the theory of mind related to God's existence, which is known as the psychophysical harmony argument, which is talking about this subjective experience that we have from a evolutionary standpoint, or from a materialistic standpoint, or any standpoint. I mean, you could have had that experience, you could have not had that experience, and there is no expectation of a proper alignment of the subjective experience that you go through, like completely aligned with your sense perception, your like sensory modes in that sense. So he got a brilliant point, which is that okay, when we are talking about pain, and when we are talking about the problem of pain in that sense, the data point that is the problem of pain is also includes the psychophysical harmony aspect, which is that pain that we go through, the subjective experience of pain is completely matched or is aligned with our sensory input, and that itself is something that naturalism would not expect, because naturalism, under atheism or naturalism, the whole idea of having a complete alignment of subjective experience along with your sense perception and all of that is unexpected. So in fact, pain becomes becomes a data point that is actually well expected under theism and not under naturalism. So he kind of takes this on a different route, and I found that really brilliant. So I just thought that I'll mention that, which is again a philosophical side of things, but again this is a important point that shows how okay, so the aspect of pain that is matched with the sensory input that we have, and all of that is actually a data point which is expected under theism, but that itself is not expected in the naturalism. So I just thought of mentioning that.
Well, that's great because I had never heard that. So, what's the name of? Do you remember the author or where he wrote it?
Yeah. Yeah, his name is Patrick Flynn, and the book is The Best Argument for God's Existence. He recently came on my channel, and one section within his book is related to suffering. This is where he does a comparison between naturalism and theism. So yeah, and now he wrote that book 3 years back. Now there has been recently more development related to the argument from psychophysical harmony, which has actually expanded this discussion and make his point more robust.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm glad. I need to watch that episode of yours. So,
Yeah,
it sounds really
yeah,
good.
it's gonna release soon. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
One of the things that I meant to mention when we were talking about that frontal lobe, and this will be very important when we start talking about um, empathy, is that it's
Mm,
important to realize that this the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC, where we feel the distressing aspect of pain, also has the highest number of opioid receptors in your entire body. And what we're going to find is that this is going to be important because when we feel pain in that part of our body, it doesn't matter whether it's caused by damaged tissues or damaged relationships. If we have a broken leg or a broken heart, if we are put in a functional MRI and they scan our brain, that same front of the brain will light up because we perceive all pain, social or physical, in that spot. And so the fact that there's a neural overlap between social and physical pain there is actually going to help. We're going to see that that's going to help reduce pain when we have positive interactions that release natural opioids in that frontal lobe. Okay, so I want to just put that in there. But
Mm.
before we get there, let's just talk about the types of pain in nature. There's 3 types. This is according to the National Academy of Sciences. There's really good material. I recommend it in the recognition and alleviation of pain in laboratory animals. Because even though they talk about laboratory animals, it really does. You can take what they're telling you out into nature as well. But basically, the 3 types of nature is first is acute. This is like a quick stick or prick on the finger, something that briefly hurts, but you quickly withdraw and the pain goes away very, very quickly. Then you have persistent pain. If you sprained your ankle, it's going to hurt for, probably on and off for 6 weeks because you need that persistent warning to not put too much weight on it, because if you keep putting your weight on it, it won't heal properly. So your body's going to warn you. That's why also, like, if you cut your finger, it turns out that you get hypersensitivity to any touch in the area around that cut because your body is giving you hypersensitivity. So pressure that normally would not make you feel anything, if you do the slightest pressure near the cut, it will hurt because that, again, is your body warning you not to don't overuse these tissues because they're trying to heal. So that's persistent pain. Now, in chronic pain, we get chronic pain if we have an injury that has not healed properly. So maybe something is permanently misaligned, or it could be from age, inflammation of the joints that doesn't go away, or it could be like cancer. We have chronic pain from that. And so you can see why acute pain is necessary. A quick warning to pull your hand away from a cactus. You can understand why persistent pain is necessary so we will protect our tissues as long as it takes for them to heal. But when we get to chronic pain, this is an unfortunate side effect to when our body can't heal that situation or we can't get better. So I want to also, often we just use pain and suffering interchangeably. So if pain is, I've explained how's your body perceive pain, and I've discussed the 3 types of pain, and I'd like to distinguish it with the term suffering. Let's use suffering to refer to persistent or chronic pain that can't be healed, or it could be significantly mitigated through proper medical treatment or pain medication or adequate nutrition and or empathetic care, but it's not. When it could be helped, but it's not, we're going to say that long enduring pain is suffering. Okay, just to help clarify some terminology. Okay, and this is where, when we talk about chronic pain, this is where the role of predators is actually very important, because predators selectively target the weak or sickly animals that would otherwise suffer. They kill those prey quickly and efficiently, and they minimize the duration of animals that would otherwise suffer. Because one of the things that the scientific evidence is very clear is that predators selectively look for weaker, sickly animals that even when humans are just observing, they can't tell which animal is sick, which one's not. But when they're able to actually get hold of the carcasses and analyze them, they'll often have disease or injuries or, parasites or something that if the animal had lived longer, they might have started to suffer. But the predators had this amazing capacity to notice very subtle changes in the body language of these animals and tell this one is stressed, this one is not. I'll take the stressed one because that's the one that's going to be unhealthy. Okay. And so
Um,
they're actually uh, the euthanizers of sick animals in nature. And they also improve the overall health of the ecosystem and all the creatures that live there. So apex predators are, like the wolves that were reintroduced to Yellowstone. They maintain good ecological balance by controlling the herbivore populations. They improve habitats. They keep mesopredators, like lower level predators, in check. So, for example, there's a really, I mentioned this in my book, The Problem of Animal Pain, but there's really good evidence from Yellowstone where they reintroduced wolves that they solved a lot of the environmental degradation that was happening because there were no predators there. And for example, the elk were, they loved to eat the new growth of trees that would be along the riverbanks. Now, normally they can't graze there and eat the young trees because wolves would quickly, we got at you and we're going to kill you. And they'd have to run away. But without any of the wolves, they could go ahead and eat every single young tree that was trying to start growing on the banks of the waterways. And since those trees were no longer there to hold the banks in up in place and keep them stable, they started to have erosion and get poor water quality, and you lost a lot of habitat. Um, and actually, when they brought the wolves back and the elk were then kept in check, not only did those trees come back along the waterways, but the beavers then use them to build dams. When the beaver builds a dam, they create like a micro pond, and now you have a new area of fish and amphibians and birds that come in, and it expands the biodiversity in the national park. And so that's one of the ways that they improve habitats, and by they keep mesopredators in check. So if there's coyotes that were, and foxes and stuff that were running wild and killing young deer, pronghorn deer. And so the pronghorn deer population was really stressed because there were too many coyotes attacking their young. But with the wolves there, the wolves would attack the coyotes so that they weren't going to, that took pressure, predatory pressure off of the pronghorn deer. And so that those populations were able to come back. So we think that of predators are bad, they just eat everything, and they're an unfortunate side effect of a terrible creation. Well, actually, they help ecosystems stay healthy and biodiverse. Okay. And so another way they do this is that when a predator actually has a kill and they're not successful all the time, usually their success rates are usually only around 30%. When you have killer sharks and you have very young and stupid seals, you can get that up to maybe 50%, but usually only 1 in 3 times a predator tries to get something to eat will they actually make a kill. But that doesn't even just feed the predator. That carcass will then feed scavengers and decomposers as well. And that's important. We don't realize it, but it increases food availability across the ecosystem. For example, on that carcass, it's gross, but you have insects that their larvae grow on the carcass. Then those insects change and they fly away, and songbirds eat them. So now you're creating the food source for songbirds. At the same time, you have like the same carcass, you could feed golden eagles, you could feed bears and other scavengers that can eat there. And then since you've taken pressure off of, you also have the case where keeping pressure off of other creatures, like suppressing the coyotes, you also can have more rodents that normally would eat coyotes, but now instead of just feeding coyotes, you have enough rodents that they could feed owls and raptors and, other birds of prey. So predators are actually necessary for healthy ecosystems. And we can say, okay, well, that's great. It reduces how long an animal will have to suffer, but isn't it still cruel that they had to get killed by a predator? And actually, we overlook the fact that mammals and birds have a similar adrenal response that blocks pain in both of them if they're attacked by a predator. So actually, we that's something that we need to take into consideration because we watch National Geographic, we watch Blue Planet, we see these poor antelope getting attacked by lions, and of course, we feel terrible, like they're ripping out our guts because number one, we're very empathetic creatures. We feel if we see someone else being have experiencing pain, we actually can feel it in our own bodies. So we feel that way for the animals. But we forget that our body is in a different physiological state than the animal being attacked. So when they see the predator, they feel fear. It's a yucky feeling, but it's necessary for survival because fear triggers a cascade of stress hormones. We call this the adrenal response, and it focuses the attention of the creature to fighting, fleeing, and surviving. So some of these stress hormones are, for example, cortisol. It floods the muscles with glucose for immediate energy. The epinephrine increases your heart rate and alertness. So I guess, like when humans experience it, we actually become better test takers. Actually, if you get nervous before taking an exam, that's the adrenal response kicking in because you're fearful, and it's actually going to give you a little bit of an edge during the test because that epinephrine is going to help your alertness and cognitive abilities. But that's to help you survive. And then you also have endogenous opioids. Endogenous means just your own body's naturally produced opioids. They're actually more powerful than morphine. They can be released during this adrenal response and it blocks the ACC so you don't feel any pain. There's a really good account in my the book, The Purpose of the Problem of Animal Pain that I love. Not that this happened to him, but there's a man that was attacked by a great white shark off the coast of South Africa. And one of the things that happened during the event, it's really interesting because as he tells the account, you can check off a list of all the things that he's telling you he's experiencing that you can see this is from the adrenal response. This is from the cortisol. This is from the epinephrine he's going through. But one of the things, the pain blockage was so strong. He had been trying to the shark came at him. He tried to push on top of the shark as it's coming by, and he couldn't figure out why he couldn't kind of straddle it and get on it like a horse. And he had to visually look down to see that his leg below the knee was in the teeth of the shark. Like he couldn't feel it. He had to look and see it. And so then the shark dove underwater and he then got really angry, which is part of the fight or flight. Like when we say fight or flight, he first tried to flee. He tried to get up on the shark and push away. That didn't work. So now he's dragged underwater and now the fight response kicks in. He got really angry and started punching this shark in the nose and poking it in the eyes. Now, those are good strategies, and that is the epinephrine giving him better cognitive plans on how am I going to escape this? I have a strategy. But he also had endogenous opioids. I told you that they blocked the pain so much that he didn't even realize his leg was in the shark's mouth. But also, he didn't realize that he was punching the shark to the bone. He did survive this, but he was wearing off the skin on his hand down to the bone from punching this. Now, he noticed he was sliding further and further to along the body of the shark. And so he gave one more big push, and he kind of heard a crack and he got free. And so he floated up to the surface of the water. He was nearly unconscious, but his friends in the boat were able to pull him on board, and his brother grabbed his leg and held it underneath his arm. So the man couldn't see what had happened to to his leg. But the blockers were so strong, he didn't even realize he had lost his entire leg from the knee down.
That
And
was
so
amazing.
we don't fully appreciate how much when we go through a crisis that initiates the adrenal response, those opioids are to prevent suffering. They are to block pain so that you don't focus on your injuries. You focus on being strong and getting away from the danger. And so that leads into the other effects. With this, the adrenal response will also give you increased muscle tension, it diverts the blood flow to the skeletal muscles, which are your big ones that you need for fighting or flighting. And then it gives you that temporary inhibition of digestion. It's basically stopping the digestion and dumping all the blood sugar you've got in the tissues into the bloodstream so that you can have all the energy your body will need in order to survive. Okay. So, any other thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, that was amazing. That was really powerful. So this is where I just want to stress on the fact that how much of the data philosophers are missing out when they are not acknowledging the science of these things. And this is where I feel really like grateful for the fact to go through these things and have have this synthesis between the science and the philosophy and the theology in that sense. And then when we look at things, okay, we have more perspective, we have a deeper perspective regarding these things. And it was really fascinating to me. I was reading your going through your book and also through this presentation is the fact that within philosophy, what when they look at the animal kingdom and nature, what do they generally say? They say nature red in tooth and claw, and that, and the whole narrative is very much fixated on the fact that, oh, it's very cruel, it's bad. But science gives us another side of the whole predatory prey thing, then how the what the prey might be experiencing in that sense, and and what the predator actually brings into the whole ecosystem and why it's healthy in that sense. All of these things are something that we don't acknowledge much. Fact that well, now we go through it, I think it's a very important thing that philosophers and others should acknowledge, which gives you a complete different perspective about nature. You see the beauty within, you start seeing the beauty within nature, even despite, like, within our, like, our empathetic systems telling us that, okay, yeah, that's, oh, it's bad and I feel the pain, but there is a beauty to it, which I'm so glad that you bring it out in a very nice manner.
Well, thank
So
you.
that's
Thank
all
you.
I have to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about having some pictures of, lions attacking a gazelle, but like even knowing what I know about blocking the pain, it still is gross and it hurts my feelings to watch it. So I totally understand when people get upset because I think that's also our God-given empathy that we're supposed to
Mm,
care about other creatures and other human beings. So when we see someone being injured, whether or not they're feeling pain, we feel like, well, their life can end. So do I need to step in and help? So, and that's an appropriate response. Okay.
correct.
So we're going to be moving to the empathetic part in a minute, but I just want to
So
recap some of the things. So, like we were talking about the physiological requirements of pain perception, and those actually weaken the atheist narratives. So, like we were talking about that the only the humans, mammals, and birds had the frontal lobe to feel the distressing aspect of pain. That the reptiles, amphibians, and fish can locate noxious stimuli, but they do it without pain, and um, that we actually have for mammals and birds and humans are mammals, that we have this natural pain blocking in emergency stress situations. So we've kind of talked about the predator dynamic. Now we're going to be
mm,
shifting to, well, what about someone like most of us don't have predators in our lives that we have to worry about, right?
Hmm.
So what we have to worry about is the pain from illness, injury, social loss, someone we love, either betrayed us or they died or we lost our job. We have a lot of pain to deal with that doesn't involve predators. And that's where empathy comes into to the discussion here. So I want to talk about the brain opioid theory of social attachment. And this is the important part about babies. Um, Now, again, just to remind you, when I showed you the picture of the frontal lobe, that has the greatest number of opioid receptors in the body. And there's a neural overlap between, you'll feel pain there, whether it's social or it's physical. At the same time, that also means that if you feel social love, that's going to release opioids in the very area that you were feeling physical pain. So, in the brain opioid theory of social attachment, our response to pain, whether it's physical or social, is soothed by loving interactions. We have the release of those endogenous opioids I talked about in the ACC. We can have it whether it's fight or flight, but we can also have it from these positive interactions. And so this is something that's learned in childhood from caregiver infant interactions. And that's why lots of FaceTime, lots of personal, cooing to the baby. And even as they get older, spending time parent to child is really important because in childhood, the brain's developing. That's where these loving, empathetic interactions release powerful, naturally produced opioids that interact with those opioid receptors in the ACC of the frontal lobe, where that psychological distress component of pain is perceived. So that, in other words, we're developmentally hardwired in childhood to receive pain relief from other people. And that's why the loving physical touch, the eye contact, and human interaction is essential in the earliest stages of development. And it creates, you're actually helping the neural connections in the growing brain to be associating loving human interactions with pain relief. And so we see this in animals too. Like these are all pictures of, I assume they're all mothers, but there's probably some dads in there, but, parents and children in the animal kingdom. And so mammals and birds also learn to be comforted and soothed by their caregivers and experience pleasure and peacefulness in this way during infancy. If these infants, whether they're human or non human, don't experience healthy, lasting relationships with their caregivers, they end up more susceptible to anxiety, depression, and post traumatic stress disorder later on in life. So, that might be one of the consequences of um, putting our kids in daycares that are busy and crowded instead of having a parent stay home and having that personal face-to-face time. And also, unfortunately, we've been putting screens and devices in front of very young babies, very young children to keep them entertained because, oh, the people that are selling them to us tell them it will be good for their brain development. Well, the thing is, it is wiring their brain differently. It's basically wiring the brain with dopamine hits, which is like eating chocolate bars by playing a little game instead of looking to other human beings for healthy feelings and relationships. Okay. So we observe that empathy reduces pain among mammals and birds across the created order. After a fight, ravens comfort the distressed losers by offering beak-to-beak nudging and friendly preening. Distressed Asian elephants comfort one another with vocal communications, very low rumbles, and direct physical contact. And of course, we've seen that all over TV that chimpanzees console each other in times of distress by hugging and kissing. Humans also reduce pain with empathy. When we receive empathetic care from others, it releases our natural endogenous opioids into the opioid receptors of the ACC in the frontal lobe. They calm and comfort us, reducing our pain, whether that pain comes from relational pain, which can be caused by social exclusion, job loss, or the loss of a loved one. But it would also comfort us if our pain comes from damaged tissues, broken bones, or illness. When we receive this empathetic care from one another, it helps us feel safe and cared for. And this is where it begins to align very well with the ethics of the Bible, which tells human beings to love God and love one another as we love ourselves. And this comes from the teaching of Jesus. It can be found in three of the Gospels, but I've given you one of them here, Matthew 22:36-40. But also these sum up the Old Testament too, from Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18. Basically, they say the first and greatest commandment is to love God with all of our heart, our soul, our mind, and our strength. And the second greatest commandment, which is very like it, is to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So this is God's ethic is love-oriented. And just to give the audience a understanding, the word in the Greek used here is agape love. And agape love refers to a selfless, sacrificial, and unconditional love. It is not quid pro quo. If you help me, I'll help you. It's a type of love that we prioritize the well-being of others, whether it's reciprocated or not. It's an act of the will, not the emotions. And Jesus taught that this agape love was meant for both friends and enemies. And this is what he meant when he said, love others the way we love ourselves. And we then see that ties in well with the fact that loving, empathetic relationships reduce pain, but they're costly, and they invest a lot. They require an investment of our time and presence. And so one of the things we need to realize is that non-sufferers play an important role when we talk about the problem of pain and suffering in the world. And this is something that philosophers, I think, almost always have ignored, the role of the non-sufferer for helping the pain of the sufferer. And so we're going to start to look at the responsibilities. We're not going to just focus on the sufferer, but we're going to look at the responsibilities of those who do not suffer. And so in the test of suffering, while the suffering may be a test for those who suffer, like Job, Scripture suggests that the greater test is for the people who do not suffer. Because suffering reveals the true children of God. They are those who choose to love God and others even when it's costly. In other words, they fulfill the two greatest commandments even when it's difficult. Suffering asks us if we will choose to be the children of God. Will we love others and mitigate their suffering even when it may be costly to us? Or will we choose to be physically and emotionally unavailable to others and leave them to sit in their pain alone? And this is where the story of Jesus told about the parable of Lazarus and the rich man is relevant, and where Jesus taught that we will be judged by how we respond to those who suffer. And this is found in Luke 16. In this story, we're told Lazarus was a beggar who laid at the gate of a rich man. He was hungry and very sick, and the dogs licked the sores on his body. The rich man passed Lazarus every time he went out of his gate, but he did nothing to comfort or help Lazarus. When the beggar Lazarus died, the angels took him to Abraham's side in heaven. But when the rich man died, he was tormented in the fire of Hades without even a drop of water to cool his tongue. What was the reason? Speaking from heaven, Abraham told the rich man, "In your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. but now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Notice that the one who suffered without help in this life, Lazarus, was taken to heaven after his death to be comforted. And the one capable of caring for Lazarus, but who left him to suffer alone, was sent to endure his own suffering in the next life. While this story is called Lazarus and the Rich Man, the man's sin was not his wealth per se. Wealth is not required to lessen pain. His sin was that he ignored Lazarus' suffering even though he was capable of alleviating it. Yet even those without wealth can alleviate pain. In the parable of the sheep and the goats, Jesus teaches that all people will be judged by how they responded to those who suffer. The sheep will be on his right, and they'll be blessed and receive their inheritance in the kingdom of God. But the goats on his left will be cursed and sent to the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. How were the sheep different than the goats? The sheep who were blessed at the judgment fed the hungry, quenched the thirsty, clothed the naked. And we should notice that these are material needs, that they do require some degree of wealth. But the sheep also offered their care and empathy. They welcomed the stranger. They looked after the sick. They visited the prisoner. Notice that all of these are non-material, empathetic needs that do not require money or wealth. So we need to realize that our response as non-sufferers matters when it comes to the problem of pain. Our response to suffer reveals those who choose to be the children of God and reveals those who do not. Will we lessen the pain of those who suffer by sharing our time, our ears, and our hearts? So how are we to understand a benevolent God and the purpose of pain? Purpose of pain. In Romans 8, it tells us, the scripture tells us that creation groans like a woman giving birth, so that the children of God may be revealed. Pain is mitigated in sufferers by the empathetic love of others. We saw this earlier. So the greater test of suffering is not for those that suffer, but it's actually for those who do not. The children of God are those who love God and others even when costly. If this world is where the children of God reveal themselves by loving even when costly, how could they do so in a world without cost? And this is something that the philosophers don't think about. That this may well be the theological purpose for pain and suffering in the world. To give a chance to each of us to decide for ourselves, not by our lip service, but by our actions. Do we actually love others as we love ourselves? Even when it may be difficult, do we show up and help others? If we do, then we're the children of God. But if we don't, and we don't care, and we step over their bodies like the rich man, then we are not the children of God, because God asks those who are his children to love others as they love themselves. So he has a love-oriented ethic. So going back to William Rowe's Two Defeaters, he said that pain and suffering was acceptable if the prevention of suffering permitted an evil equally bad or worse. Well, pain is a biologically necessary warning system for more evolved animals. And intelligent, long-lived animals that rear fewer offspring and require greater parental investment could not survive without pain perception. That would be an evil equally bad or worse. But also, we fulfill the defeater if the prevention of suffering permitted the loss of the greater good. The greater good is that without pain, The children of God who love others even when costly could not be revealed. The Bible tells us God's value system is love. Atheists and philosophers often assume that God's value system is similar to theirs. It's about pleasure and goods. But God's value system is about love. God loves us. So we are to love ourselves and love others as we love ourselves. That is the coin of the realm in the kingdom of God. So Paul Draper's hypothesis of theism, when we talk about our hypothesis of theism, theism anticipates a finely tuned cosmos defined by natural laws and mathematical precision. It anticipates a telos in the universe that would enable life to exist. And it also explains why human beings would have an innate sense of morality, why human beings would have the desire for relationship with the divine. It explains why a loving God would minimize unnecessary suffering in animals, and why a loving God would use empathetic love to reduce pain. The hypothesis of indifference from Paul Draper says the universe doesn't care. But what does this hypothesis anticipate? Nothing. What does it explain? It explains nothing. This hypothesis is the statement of a negative that cannot be tested. So the hypothesis has no predictive power because it is not falsifiable. Even if indifference means 50-50 random chance, then that means everything is dumb luck and coincidence. Therefore, this is not a hypothesis, or in other words, the hypothesis of indifference can predict and explain nothing at all. Therefore, the hypothesis of theism has more explanatory power than the hypothesis of indifference.
Wow, yeah, I really enjoyed that. So it was very impactful. It covered so much, and I'm so grateful that we were able to cover so much of ground. So maybe a few comments that I have. One is that when it comes to the idea of love and also the idea of test, as you mentioned, it is very much relevant from an Islamic perspective as well. Like there is a lot of overlap within the Abrahamic traditions, and the idea of like sharing love, caring for others is something that we all share within the Abrahamic faiths, and this is a theodicy that we all can share in that sense, at least some of it, most of it, I would believe. And in fact, from an Islamic perspective, we have this meta theodicy where we believe that okay, we are on this earth to emulate God's attributes. So for example, if God is the most caring, God is the most merciful, God is the most loving, what we call him al wudud, which is the loving, a giving love in that sense. We have an opportunity to try to emulate God's attributes, so with whatever limited way we have. And this is where we have to share love with others, we have to share care with others, we have to be just at the same time. If God is just, we have to be just in that sense. And I see kind of like these things very fascinating, where theists, like they all at in some cases converge to what our role is. For example, from a big biblical standpoint, if I'm not mistaken, there's this idea of stewardship.
Yeah.
We have something very similar. We call it, we also call it stewardship or custodianship on earth, and we are responsible agents in that sense. We bestowed, like earth is given to us by God, and we are responsible for everything that we do. We have to take care of earth in that sense. So all of these things make sense to me very, very clearly, like yeah, like I mean, and we see that from a theistic perspective, if that is the case, that if life is a test, and if God wants to see how much we care, how much we love, how much we spread justice, then there has to be this precondition where you of some kind of thing that you have to fix in that sense. This is where our role comes in. For example, there has to be fear, only then courage makes sense. Like courage is when you surpass or try to transcend fear, so the condition of fear should be there, and then courage would make sense. The same way compassion would only make sense when there is something to be compassionate about. So yeah, I mean, I find these theodicies very, very powerful. So, from an Islamic perspective, there is a deep discussion with a lot of nuances and lot on love, mercy, compassion. Basically, from an Islamic standpoint, love is profoundly important, but it is not the only divine attribute reflected in creation. Love exists alongside wisdom, justice, and purpose. So, when suffering becomes an opportunity for compassion, patience, generosity, and self care, Muslims see the manifestation of multiple divine attributes within creation, along with love. But the more interesting part is that, from an Islamic perspective, love is an ayah. The Quran teaches us not merely to explain reality but to read it. Creation is filled with signs pointing beyond themselves to the Creator. Even love itself is presented as one of those signs. You have this verse in the Quran, chapter 30, verse 21. And among his signs is that he created for you spouses from among yourself so that you may find tranquility in them. And he placed between mawadda and mercy, rahmah. Indeed, in that are signs for a people who reflect, and this extends far beyond marriage. Since it's an ayah, the believer should reflect, what is this pointing towards? Every created beauty becomes an invitation to know the creator behind it. The Quran repeatedly introduces Allah as Al Wadud, the most loving, and Ar Rahman, the lovingly merciful or the entirely merciful, reminding us that love, mercy, and compassion are woven into the very fabric of creation. The Prophet ﷺ tells us in another narration that all mercy we witness when a mother animal's care for her young comes from just one part of Allah's mercy sent into creation. Now let's reflect back on love. So, philosopher J.P. Andrew recently developed an argument showing how the existence of genuine interpersonal love itself is less expected under naturalism and much more expected under theism. He explains how adaptive behavior and love are not the same thing. Basically, you could imagine a creature having the outwardly behavior without having inwardly experience of love. However, from a natural selection perspective, such creatures would just be as successful as we are, yet they would lack love. He explains how love cannot fully be explained away by evolutionary biology or neurology. So, from an evolutionary standpoint, it only explains many of the behaviors associated with love, but it does not thereby explain why those behaviors should be accompanied by conscious love. Plus, why love presents itself as a response to the value of persons, or why it appears to be among the highest intrinsic goods we know. And from a neurological perspective, identifying the neural correlates of love does not explain why those processes should give rise to conscious experience, rather, unconscious information processing, nor why love possesses its distinctive normative character. That is, why it presents itself as an appropriate response to another person's worth. Moreover, there's more to note. Love does not merely feel pleasant, it feels appropriate. When a person loves a child or husband, faithfully cares for his wife through illness, they do not ordinarily experience themselves as carrying out genetic programming. They experience themselves as responding to someone who is genuinely worth of love. A love presents itself not merely as useful but as fitting. Lastly, love endures long after every obvious evolutionary advantage has disappeared. A spouse continues caring for a partner with advanced dementia. Parents lovingly devote themselves to children who may never reciprocate their care. Such examples suggest that love is directed towards the enduring worth of the person rather than merely toward traits that happen to benefit us. So, if ultimate reality is fundamentally personal and perfectly good, then creatures capable of genuine giving love are exactly the kind of beings we would expect. By contrast, if ultimate reality is ultimately impersonal, then while evolution may explain cooperative behavior, it becomes much less obvious why conscious beings capable of genuine self sacrificial love should exist at all. Now, he formulates his argument like this: genuine interpersonal love exists. If classical theism is true, the existence of genuine interpersonal love is relatively unsurprising. If atheism is true, the existence of genuine interpersonal love is much more surprising. Therefore, the existence of genuine interpersonal love is evidence favoring classical theism over atheism. Now, let's go back and reflect on what Dr. Victoria Campbell explained. It is fascinating to note how many aspects within us and the animal kingdom function like a love oriented system, as she explained. Pain isn't an isolated phenomenon in this, it's embedded inside a wider relational system in which empathy, attachment, and love reduce suffering. If pain itself has a role in this love oriented system, there's something very important to reflect upon, which actually strengthens the comparative argument for theism versus naturalism. So, if from a broader perspective, naturalism claims to be the overall better explanation, The naturalism isn't merely being asked to explain pain, rather, it's being asked to explain an entire relational architecture. A world where conscious pain gives rise to empathy, empathy motivates costly care strengthens loving relationship, and those relationships biologically and psychologically reduce suffering. Pain creates the very arena in which some of love's greatest expressions become possible. Naturalism must explain while reality is arranged so that one of the deepest goods we know, love, is one of the primary means through which one of the deepest hardship we experience, suffering, is alleviated. That's an extraordinary specific pattern. Under theism, this kind of elegant, purposive integration can be expected from a wise and benevolent God, but under naturalism, it's another layer of coincidence requiring explanation. And lastly, let's go back to Patrick Flynn's argument from Psychophysical Harmony. Naturalism must also explain why pain has the very qualitative character that it does, and why that experience is so remarkably aligned with the physical realities it represents. This psychophysical harmony, when combined with the broader architecture of care, makes the naturalistic hypothesis progressively more difficult to sustain. So, the explanatory challenge for naturalism is cumulative. It must explain the felt reality of pain, the existence of genuine interpersonal love, and finally, the remarkable architecture of care that connects them. This is where I think naturalism fails to account for these realities and theism starts to have better explanations. One thing that I want you to comment on a bit more is that the atheist, whenever they frame this argument, we had spoken about this previously, is they have their own hedonic assumption, which is that the greatest value is the greatest value is eradication of pain in some sense. But we as theists generally we don't share that. If we go back to our scriptures, if we go back to our understanding of the world, we don't see that. So I think that is something that we sometimes just forget and jump on the bandwagon and try to uh, accept that and then see where it goes. But I think from the get go, I want you to comment on where we don't even accept that, okay, no, the greatest value is not the eradication of pain. Like, if you can emphasize a bit more on that.
Yeah, I think you make a good point, and um, one of the things, if you think about hedonism, if you think about pleasure is the highest good, that's very selfish and self-oriented, and it ignores the pain of other people, because as long as I'm getting my pleasure, the pain of other people doesn't matter. And so that's where you get situations where if pleasure is your highest good, then why would someone help someone else or stand against evil if doing so would be costly to themselves, or they would be hurt, they would feel pain, they might be killed? So hedonism does not generate people that will stand up against evil. Hedonism does not generate good people that will defend other people, and even if it is costly to themselves. But a love-oriented ethic accepts, I will accept pain, I will accept cost, maybe I will even accept death to help someone else because I love them. Maybe even if they're a stranger. I mean, like, you see grown men who see a house on fire. They don't know the people inside. But if there's a child in the upper room, they will run in that house to save the child, because their empathy gives them this drive that I know this is dangerous, but is worth the cost because I care about that other person. And so hedonism would never create morally good people that help one another. And what you get is, I'm trying to remember the name of Martin Nowak, and I can't remember it's the woman's name. But basically, they were talking about hedonists are going to end up being takers in society. Because if they, versus the people who are other oriented, like I love you as
Mm,
much as I love they're going to be sharing in society. And they
mm,
they did mathematical modeling, and they basically showed that parasite is it's too strong of a word, but people who are
mm.
selfish and just take their own needs into account and are taking from society but not giving, a society can only survive with a certain number of those people. But if the whole once you get to a critical mass where you have some people are givers, but there's too many takers, the society will collapse. So that's one thing that goes against the hedonism. But also, um, if you think about it, now think about the consequences of a hedonistic lifestyle at the end of your life. So here you have two patients in the hospital. They both had the same type of cancer. They have the same stage. But the nurses notice one patient needs so much medication and it's not alleviating any of their pain. You can't give them any more or it could kill them. But the other patient in the other room doesn't need nearly as much medication. And the reason is they have visitors and they have a relationship with God. And between the emotional love between the patient and God, and that them with the other people in their lives that are checking in on them and making sure they're okay and visiting with them, it turns out that that person was a more loving, selfless person that has more people in their life. So in the ending stages of their life, they have less pain because they have that empathetic love that they themselves nurtured all their lives. But someone who's selfish, someone that uses people and throws them away when they no longer give them pleasure, is going to reach the end of their life. They may have a lot of money, but they don't have relationships. That person is going to be left sitting alone with their pain, and even the pain meds won't be enough to stop the way they feel, and they're hurting.
All right. Yeah, that was beautiful. So maybe I've got just two points to mention, I think, and then maybe we can end the discussion. I mean, firstly, before even mentioning those points, I'm really grateful that we were able to do this, and so much to learn from these slides and from what you bring into the table. Maybe just one thing that I can bring up on stage is within your book. Firstly, I want to show everyone your book. This is a brilliant book, guys. Like it covers so much. People would I would say genuinely enjoy going through this, whoever's interested in this topic. Now within this book I try to summarize some of the research studies, the science that you bring in. Maybe you
Mhm.
can just very quickly go through some studies that maybe we did not cover, which was very interesting. So
Okay,
you we
my
covered. Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
my favorite is the insect injury studies. Those are so cool because um, it's just incredible. They have all these examples of insects, so they're invertebrates, um,
Hmm.
and like okay, one of the things that is crazy is that over and over again, they're always talking about the caterpillar that suffers horribly because a wasp lays its eggs inside the caterpillar. The larva eat it from the inside out and eventually kill it. And isn't that
Hmm.
horrible suffering? Well, again, that caterpillar doesn't have the frontal lobe. It doesn't feel pain. So,
Hmm.
and I know it's really hard for us to wrap our heads around, well, how can you be eaten inside and not feel pain? Well, number one, even people that have parasites often don't feel anything. They might get tired and weak, but or sickly, but they're not feeling it. But also, you know, we also experience something like that with apoptosis. So that's programmed cellular death, where every day we're millions of our body's cells are dying, but we are not writhing in pain from this death because our neurological system is not hardwired to give us pain from that kind of cellular death because it would have no survival benefit. The same thing with the caterpillar. what is it gonna do if something's biting it? I mean, it doesn't, know karate. It doesn't have defensive mechanisms that it could, like, strategize how it's gonna escape from this. So, you see in the insect studies, you can have, um, a damaged leg on, like, a centipede, and it'll keep stepping on it like it pays no attention. They have, um insects that had been half dissected that then flew off the board that the scientist was working, and it flew off over to the sugar water and started drinking. And then you have other, like, well, I don't know if it's praying mantises or the black widows or something, but where, the the mate is eating the other one, and it's still, doing whatever it normally likes to do. I mean, it just they seem completely impervious to any kind of physical discomfort from what's happening, which is a relief. Like, I don't want animals to suffer, and I'm not gonna be upset when I find out they don't have the neurological structures to feel pain. I'm
Mm.
grateful for that. Um, what else? So, the Beecher World War II study, that was great too because, like, I think it was Anzo Beach during, Normandy, the invasion of Normandy. I mean, we just had June 6th, just saw a movie about it. But on this, you had, there was a Harvard anesthesiologist that was probably a lot younger, but he was on the beaches as a doctor on Normandy Day, and he was on the Enzo Beach, and what he found that shocked him was that he was seeing horrible injuries. He saw pieces of metal sticking out of people's heads, out of their chests, body parts missing, and when he asked them if they needed morphine, only 1 out of 4 said yes. 25% of them said, "No, I'm fine." And the reason is because just like that man with the shark, they found that when you have inescapable danger, right? You're trapped and you've got to fight. So these soldiers that are in the landing craft and they have nowhere else to go but to the front line or death. When you have circumstances like that, you have more than just opioids. There's other pathways, biochemical processes that block pain, but all these different levels of pain blockage to help you survive through that. That's why the soldiers, very few of them needed that pain medication. In contrast, then, when he went back to civilian life and he would do surgeries on patients, he said after the surgery, 80% would be begging for pain medication. And it was such a contrast between the soldiers and the civilians. But the difference is the civilian was not facing a life-threatening trap. I have to do this and I'm in danger. They chose elective surgery. And so in those situations, your body doesn't release all those natural painkillers. So you need to get artificial ones. So that was interesting from that World War II study. Were there any others that stood out to you? I'm looking at the list.
Yeah, I think covered all the interesting ones, and most of them I think we touched on them.
I think so.
This one, maybe severe trauma can suppress pain and consciousness.
Yeah.
Shock,
Which one is that? Extreme
shock
pain.
induced.
Okay, shock, and oh yeah, that's another thing. So one of the things that, like, we, whenever you have, whenever an animal has, and I'm talking like the ones that we're worried about feeling pain, mammals and birds, but like when you have when you have a lot of blood loss, you go into hemorrhagic shock. Okay, shock, whether it's caused by blood loss, whether it's caused by sepsis, which is an infection of the bloodstream, or it's like spinal shock. you fall and you fall off a cliff and you break your spine, all of those, you are going to quickly go into shock, but shock releases like full blast opioids in your frontal lobe, so you don't feel the pain. You're gonna die quickly because one of the things is it's withdrawing blood from your extremities, so like your brain, and drawing it into your central cavity to try to keep you alive, but blood loss to the brain is what's gonna kill you, but you're gonna be unconscious and you're gonna have opioid blockage. So even death like that has a lot of pain relief. So like when we see, the animals on TV getting attacked,
Hmm.
number one, as soon as they had the fear when they saw the predator, that adrenal response started just like the guy who was, fighting the shark. They have pain blockage from that. But then also when they get one of the kill bites, so they get a lot of blood loss, they're gonna have hemorrhagic shock, which is more opioids being released. So it's as if God intentionally wanted to make sure that when creatures were dying, that they did not experience pain, that
Wow. Wow,
he cares.
that is amazing. Yeah, yeah, wow. That is really amazing. So I think on that note, I mean, I thought that I'll mention a few things, but I that would take this conversation to be much longer. So I don't
Mhm,
think I would just put some interesting points here. Like there was one. So let's talk about the mysterious evil. So let's say there is some kind of pain or some kind of evil that we cannot make sense of. This
mhm,
is where I believe I found Joshua Rasmussen's Substack on this, where he explained how even the mysterious evil that exists, which let's say we cannot give meaning to it, we cannot see the purpose behind it. That itself is not necessarily the case that that is something that is unpredicted under theism. Rather, he explains that mysterious evil on theism, I would expect there would be reasons beyond creaturely kin, whereas on non theism, I would expect no creatures to ever exist, or if they do exist, they would be blobs of matter incapable of wondering about anything. And then he goes on, gives 4 points. So that was the first point. Second, he says, injustice on theism, I would expect hero making arenas in which kingly creatures learn to overcome problems and bring justice in an ever advancing world. On non theism, by contrast, I wouldn't expect justice or injustice to ever be instantiated or for reality to produce any agents who can apprehend any principles of justice or injustice. Just one note is that when we talk about animals, also what I've noticed is that we generally have this perception in philosophy that okay, animals are non-moral agents in that sense, so they don't
mhm,
have these concepts. But the latest research, I think Joshua Sidwade, when coming up his upcoming book, which is the exemplary theodicy, something along the lines, he draws a lot of from the latest science, which shows that actually even if animals are not moral agents per se, but they are moral subjects in that sense,
mhm,
and they have these somewhat like very minimal justice systems and social systems in that sense, where they strive for some kind of I don't know the right word, but there's some striving within animals as well. Like even ants have their own
mhm,
system in that sense. So within that, animals are also moral subjects in that sense. They are also subjected to some kind of a moral system, if I'm not mistaken. That is what the science also was indicating, if I'm not mistaken. So these are some sources that anyone who's interested, they can, of course, they can go through your book, then they can go through the article by Joshua Rasmussen, and this new book by Joshua Sidwade, which is very similar to what you are mentioning. His idea is that even within animals there is an opportunity for them to be an exemplar in that sense, in many
mhm,
cases. So within the animal system, even if humans are not involved within that, they have these systems where they have opportunity to be an exemplar in that sense, and that could make sense of some of the suffering that we see. And this would make sense from all of the Abrahamic faiths as well, if I'm not
mhm,
mistaken, because we see the like animals have different purposes of their creation in that sense.
mhm.
So I don't know if this could be one of them. From an Islamic perspective, when we are doing a comparison between human beings and animals, of course, there's a lot of differences that we can point to. But at the same time, animals do share a lot in common with us too. For instance, Dr. Shahrukh Chaudhary in his book gives many examples. Plus, we know from many verses and narrations that animals will also be resurrected. Moreover, we have another prophetic narration which actually mentions rights will certainly be restored to those entitled to them on the day of resurrection, to the point that even the hornless sheep will settle its score with the horned sheep. So that's significant. What we learn from that is that even without any human involvement, animals are subject to some kind of rights and also some kind of accountability. So that's something I think we need to note. Just to continue with what Dr. Joshua Rasmussen has to say, the third point he mentions is that death and disease on theism, I would expect episodes in soul building adventure where there is real danger like disease. I would also expect everything bad to be able to work together for incomparably greater jewels of good in later episodes. On
Mhm.
non-theism, by contrast, it's bizarre to me that reality would happen to have any real adventure as opposed to random dots scattering randomly forever.
Mhm.
And then one last point I'll mention is that the amount of suffering on theism, I would expect the amounts of danger to be finely tuned for soul and relationship building experiences for individuals, families, cities, nations, and species. On non theism, by contrast, even if I add to the root theory that sentient beings exist, I still wouldn't expect anything as specific as pain. Instead, I would expect sentience to be chaotic, epiphenomenally, hence no adaptive role, and entirely unrelated to any meaningful life story in that sense. So I think that was
Mhm.
beautiful what he mentioned, that there, like, he combines all of this and brings pain into it, because yes, uh these adventure these adventure like stories which we all go through in our lives, yeah, pain is a meaningful and very important part of it in that sense. Now I want to pause and reflect on this further. Dr. Rasmussen adds another purpose to pain, which is for soul building and relationship building experiences. Moreover, he also connects it with meaningful life stories, which he calls narrative structures. So he has presented arguments for God's existence running on both the lines, the soul building experiences and narrative structures. Under soul building, he does talk about how the fact that the whole universe is not just fine tuned for life, but it's fine tuned for soul building experiences too. The fact that pain has a role in character development too, where a person who's gone through pain can become a better person, can have better relationships after going through pain. That's the soul building there. And the narrative structures is where he says it's not just that we are conscious beings, but we are conscious beings which go through a particular type of psychological sequence. The consciousness itself is sequenced in a narrative structure, which again has to be something unlikely under naturalism, because why would consciousness be aligned in this narrative structure? Now, within this narrative structure, he does add, or he does point to the role of pain and how pain itself can play a purpose in the overall narrative structure. Now, this gives another dimension to pain, which is hard to account for from a naturalistic perspective. If you look back to see what we have covered so far, we find so many insights and so many different reasons behind pain, which is actually making many aspects of pain and suffering expected under theism. However, there's one more final point that Dr. Rasmussen adds. He says, on theism, I'd expect various paths to discovering more and more good things in the foundation of existence, with truth seekers learning to love each other even while still in the face of deep disagreements. On non theism, by contrast, it seems surprising to me that bits of reality would or could bring to life beings who would ever wonder whether God exists. Even if sentience did occur, I would expect it to be almost entirely meaningless noise. Now, this is profound. Let me be clear. I don't mean that in a pluralistic sense, but definitely there is some value for truth seekers or believers or theists to actually strive to explore and discover deeper goods and wisdom behind the existence of pain and suffering. I mean, look at what we are doing here. Dr. Victoria Campbell and I come from very different backgrounds and we have many things to disagree about. Yet we both share this awe for God and His creation and are learning from each other, trying to make sense of God's creation and trying to understand His wisdom. This itself is something of immense value, which Dr. Rasmussen thinks would not be expected under naturalism. Remember what he mentioned? He said, "It seems surprising to me that bits of reality would or could bring to life beings who would even wonder whether God exists. Even if sentience did occur, I would expect it to be almost entirely meaningless noise." So the fact that we are having this insightful conversation on God and his wisdom behind pain would itself be some evidence unexpected under naturalism. And yeah, I guess that's all I have to maybe add into the conversation. So yeah, let me
Well,
let me know what your closing statements are. Yeah.
well, and I was gonna say that, I think there's some good, evidence out there that, like, while scripture does not hold animals or children to the same moral standard as adults, right? Because they don't have the brain capacity for it. At the same time,
Hmm.
you have excellent examples of cross species empathy. Like,
Hmm.
I can't remember where I wrote about it, but, so you have examples of where you had dolphins that spent hours keeping a dog afloat and alive when he had fallen off a pier. No one knew he was there, and so they were chattering super loud, so finally people came to find out what are these crazy dolphins doing that they're making so much noise, and that's when they realized the dog was in the water and they fished him out. And then you have other examples of where, you have mother cats taking care of baby puppies, and you have mother dogs taking care of cats, young cats. And just, beautiful examples of empathetic care that goes cross species so that, and what, Von der Vol I'm hating that I'm butchering his last name. Waal. He is, one that, like, talks about, there seems to be that morality in animals, and he has beautiful stories of, taking care of each other. Now, here's the thing. If even animals can show that kind of compassion for one another, then how much more should human beings who are made in the image of God?
Right. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. So that was brilliant. And I'm very grateful that we were able to do this, and we like get getting to learn so many of these beautiful gems from you. I think my audience would really appreciate you coming on this platform and sharing all this knowledge with us. I'm really grateful, and I would look forward to have more opportunities maybe in the future if you come up with something very interesting to invite you back on this platform. So thank you so much for coming.
I would love to do that, and I just encourage, I really think that science, and I think you agree, science, what it can tell us about the world is really beautiful, but it's beautiful because God is beautiful and God's creation is beautiful. And so if we, as when we have the right worldview, the right interpretive lens, like a love oriented lens, then things make a lot more sense if we realize that God is loving and that maybe things aren't the way we would organize them, but maybe the way God's done it is actually better.
Right, right. So yeah, on that beautiful note, I would look forward to maybe have more opportunities to speak with you. Take care.
Thank you.